What were the forgotten World War II recipes that disappeared after the war? These meals stretched rations, filled empty plates, and kept families going when supplies were scarce. But once peace returned, why did we leave behind the very foods that carried us through? Vegetable turnover pies were one of those little miracles of wartime kitchens, a way to make something filling out of scraps that did not look like much on their own. Families would take carrots, peas, cabbage, or whatever they could grow in their victory gardens, chop them up, season them lightly, and fold them into pastry dough that was often made with flour stretched by oats or potatoes. These hand pies were portable, which made them a favorite for workers and schoolchildren who needed a meal they could carry with them. They were also light on meat, which was perfect given how expensive and rationed meat was during the war. A few bits of sausage or leftover ham could be tucked inside, but most versions were completely meatless. Turnover pies were especially popular at community gatherings because large trays could be baked at once and shared among neighbors. They were cheap, clever, and comforting, which explains why so many people swore by them. Yet when the war ended and meat and butter returned, these humble pies quickly faded from memory. Cornmeal scrapple was a recipe born from frugality and a determination to waste nothing. Scrapple had roots in Pennsylvania Dutch cooking, and during World War II, it became a staple for households that needed to stretch their pork supply as far as possible. The idea was simple: boil pork scraps, bones, or trimmings until the broth was rich with flavor, then stir in cornmeal to create a thick porridge. Once it cooled, the mixture was sliced into blocks and fried until golden brown and crispy on the outside. It was hearty, filling, and cheap, making it a perfect breakfast dish that could feed an entire family with minimal cost. Cornmeal was one of the most readily available grains during rationing, and pork trimmings were easier to obtain than prime cuts, so the recipe quickly spread outside its regional roots. Many children grew up with scrapple as a regular breakfast, but once the war ended and fresher meat returned, the dish began to vanish. Today, it is remembered mostly in pockets of the country as a relic of leaner times. Parsnip fritters are one of those recipes that only hard times could have popularized. Potatoes were always in high demand, and there were moments during the war when even they were scarce or needed to be reserved for more essential meals. Enter the parsnip, a root vegetable with a sweet and earthy taste that suddenly found its way into American frying pans. Housewives would grate parsnips, mix them with flour or breadcrumbs, and fry them into golden cakes that resembled potato fritters. The flavor was different, slightly sweeter and lighter, but it satisfied the craving for something starchy and fried. Children often did not even realize they were not eating potatoes, which was a victory for mothers trying to keep meals cheerful. Parsnip fritters were versatile enough to serve with eggs, soups, or even as a meat substitute when times were desperate. They represented the spirit of improvisation, taking an overlooked vegetable and turning it into comfort food. After the war, however, parsnips quietly disappeared from most kitchens, leaving these fritters as a nearly forgotten chapter of wartime survival cooking. Homemade soy cutlets were a curious experiment that came about when soybeans began to be promoted as a miracle food during the war. With meat heavily rationed, nutrition experts encouraged families to try soy flour as a substitute. Recipes for soy cutlets began appearing in pamphlets and women's magazines, promising a dish that looked and tasted almost like a hamburger patty. The cutlets were made by mixing soy flour with water, onions, spices, and sometimes leftover breadcrumbs, shaping them into patties and frying them like meat. They were high in protein, cheap, and easy to prepare, which made them seem like the food of the future. Many families did their best to embrace them, though the flavor often left much to be desired compared to real beef. Still, they were a lifeline for people who could not afford or obtain meat regularly. After the war, the novelty faded, and most households abandoned soy cutlets in favor of traditional burgers and steaks. They remain a fascinating glimpse into how food science intersected with wartime necessity. Dried fruit compote was a sweet reprieve in a world where sugar and fresh fruit were often in short supply. Families would gather raisins, prunes, apricots, or whatever dried fruits they could afford, simmer them slowly in water, and add a bit of sugar or honey if available. The result was a warm, syrupy dish that could be eaten on its own, spooned over porridge, or served with bread. It was one of the few ways children could enjoy something resembling a dessert when candy and cakes were out of reach. For many households, compote also doubled as a way to use dried fruits sent in ration packages or purchased in bulk. It was nourishing, provided fiber and sweetness, and gave families a sense of comfort at the end of a long day. While humble, it was cherished because it reminded people of better times when fresh fruit was plentiful. Once orchards were thriving again after the war, compote fell out of fashion, but during those lean years, it was a treasured dish. Pea soup with carrot dumplings was another recipe designed to stretch rations and make simple ingredients go a long way. Dried peas were widely available, affordable, and filling, so they became the base of countless wartime meals. To make the dish more substantial, home cooks would add small dumplings made from grated carrots mixed with flour and a pinch of fat or drippings. These dumplings not only thickened the soup, but also added color and a bit of sweetness. The soup was simmered slowly, producing a rich and hearty meal that could feed an entire family with little effort. It was popular in schools, churches, and community kitchens, where large pots of it could serve dozens of people. The combination of legumes and vegetables was also encouraged by nutritionists as a balanced, protein-rich option in the absence of meat. For many children growing up during the war, pea soup with carrot dumplings was a constant presence on the table. After the war, the recipe was abandoned for more elaborate dishes, leaving it largely forgotten today. Oatmeal griddle cakes were a wartime invention that came from the scarcity of wheat flour. Oats were more widely available and less strictly rationed, so families found ways to turn them into breakfast staples. Griddle cakes made from oats, milk powder, and a little sugar were fried on cast iron pans until golden brown, resembling pancakes but with a heartier texture. They were filling, affordable, and could be eaten plain or topped with whatever syrup or fruit was available. Children often enjoyed them as a treat since they resembled the pancakes they loved but were simpler to make. In some households, grated apples or carrots were added to the batter to stretch it further and provide extra flavor. The cakes quickly became a breakfast standby during the hardest years of rationing, giving families a way to feel normal in the morning. Once wheat flour was widely available again after the war, these oat-based griddle cakes disappeared from the table. Today, they stand as an example of clever substitutions that carried families through the toughest times. Ration rice porridge was one of the most common breakfasts of the war years, a dish as simple as it was necessary. Rice was inexpensive and easy to store, making it an essential ration food for many families. The porridge was prepared by boiling rice in water or diluted milk, then sweetening it lightly with sugar, syrup, or dried fruit if available. For countless children, this was the meal that began their day, sometimes flavored with cinnamon or nutmeg when spices could be spared. It was warm, filling, and easy to prepare in large batches, which made it popular in community kitchens and schools as well. For families struggling to get through rationing, rice porridge was dependable, even if it lacked excitement. Some mothers would dress it up with a spoonful of jam or a drizzle of molasses when they could, making it feel like a small treat. After the war, rice porridge lost its place at the breakfast table, replaced by cereals, bacon, and eggs, but it played an important role during lean times. Mock goose was one of the many meatless dishes that tried to imitate flavors of meals that had disappeared from wartime tables. The recipe used lentils, breadcrumbs, onions, and herbs, shaped into a loaf and roasted until browned. When sliced and served with gravy, it bore a faint resemblance to roast goose, at least in appearance, if not in taste. Families who longed for Sunday roasts but could not afford or obtain poultry made do with this thrifty substitute. It provided protein, was hearty, and made families feel like they were still part of traditional mealtime rituals. Mock goose also symbolized the wartime creativity of making something out of nothing, turning the idea of a feast into a loaf of lentils and bread. Though it filled stomachs, it never quite fooled anyone into thinking they were eating real goose. After the war ended and poultry returned to markets, mock goose was quickly abandoned. Still, for a brief time, it was a staple of wartime Sunday dinners. Potato-carrot sandwich spread was one of the many thrifty inventions that turned vegetables into substitutes for meat-based fillings. Housewives would mash boiled potatoes and carrots together, add mustard or vinegar, and season the mixture with salt, pepper, and sometimes a bit of onion. Spread on bread, it gave the illusion of a hearty sandwich without requiring cold cuts or cheese, which were expensive and often unavailable. This spread was popular in school lunches and workplace meals because it was easy to make in large quantities. It kept well in jars, could be used in place of butter, and provided a filling bite that carried workers through long shifts. Families often experimented with variations, adding bits of pickle juice, leftover drippings, or chopped herbs depending on what was at hand. While it may not sound glamorous, it was a clever way to turn basic vegetables into something that felt substantial. After the war, when deli meats and cheeses returned to stores, this humble spread disappeared almost overnight. Today, it remains largely forgotten, except by those who lived through rationing. Homemade vinegar lemonade was one of the cleverest ways people managed to mimic the refreshing taste of lemons when citrus was either too expensive or impossible to find. With imports cut and rations tight, lemons disappeared from markets almost overnight, leaving families scrambling for alternatives. Housewives found that a splash of vinegar mixed with water and sweetened with sugar gave a sharp tang close enough to lemon juice that it became a substitute. Served chilled, it was surprisingly refreshing, especially in the summer months when people longed for a cooling drink. Children often grew up with vinegar lemonade as their only idea of lemonade during the war, and many were shocked when they first tasted real lemons again after the conflict. It was also practical because vinegar was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and easy to store in large quantities, making it one of the few dependable flavorings in pantries. While it never truly rivaled the taste of citrus, it gave a moment of brightness during difficult years. Once the war ended, vinegar lemonade vanished from tables almost instantly. Mashed rutabaga casserole was a hearty dish that helped replace potatoes when they were in short supply. Rutabagas, sometimes called Swedes, were root vegetables that grew well even in poor soil and stored for long periods without spoiling, making them ideal for wartime. The rutabagas were peeled, boiled, mashed, and then baked with a topping of breadcrumbs, a splash of milk, and a little margarine if the household was lucky enough to have it. The casserole was filling and could be served as a side dish, or even the main course when meat was not available. Children often resisted eating rutabagas because of their strong flavor, but parents encouraged them as a necessary part of the diet. Many families added onions or carrots to soften the taste and stretch the dish further. This recipe showed up frequently in government pamphlets as an example of making the most out of hardy crops. Once rationing ended and potatoes returned to tables, rutabaga casseroles disappeared quickly, remembered only by those who grew up eating them. Bean and tomato bake was one of the most dependable dishes to appear on wartime tables. It was a simple recipe made by combining white beans, tomato sauce, and seasonings, then baking the mixture until it was thick and hearty. Beans were cheap, plentiful, and highly encouraged as a source of protein, while canned tomatoes were one of the few processed foods that remained widely available. The dish was easy to prepare in large pans, which made it a popular option in schools, community kitchens, and at family gatherings. For working households, it was reliable, filling, and inexpensive, stretching ingredients without requiring much effort. It was also nutritious, combining protein from beans with vitamins from tomatoes in a way that doctors and nutritionists praised. Families often ate it with bread or served it as the centerpiece of a meatless dinner. Though it became a household staple during the war, it vanished quickly afterward, overshadowed by richer casseroles and more varied meals once rationing ended. Today, bean and tomato bake remains a forgotten reminder of ingenuity. Carrot tea sandwiches became one of the most common quick lunches during World War II. With cold cuts, butter, and cheese out of reach for many households, carrots stepped in as a surprisingly useful substitute. The recipe was as simple as grating fresh carrots, mixing them with margarine or a little mayonnaise, and spreading the mixture on bread. These sandwiches were bright, sweet, and inexpensive, making them popular in school lunchboxes and at workplaces where people needed something portable and cheap. Housewives embraced the carrot sandwich not only because it stretched rations, but also because carrots were heavily promoted by government campaigns for their nutrition and affordability. Many families grew carrots in their victory gardens, which made them even more accessible. They were not glamorous or indulgent, but they kept people fed when there were few alternatives. After the war ended and lunch meats returned to stores, carrot tea sandwiches faded quickly into obscurity. For those who lived through rationing, though, they were unforgettable. Molasses oatmeal porridge was one of the most comforting breakfasts of the war years, though its sweetness was more practical than indulgent. With sugar rationed and often unavailable, molasses became the go-to sweetener for everything from breads to desserts. Oatmeal itself was affordable, filling, and easy to prepare, making it a natural choice for families who needed to stretch food supplies. When combined with molasses, the porridge gained a rich, dark sweetness that made it easier for children to eat. Many households relied on this breakfast to provide energy for long workdays and school mornings. It was also praised for being highly nutritious, since molasses added iron and other minerals along with its flavor. Though it was a staple during rationing, many families grew tired of it and quickly abandoned the recipe once sugar and other sweeteners returned. Today, molasses oatmeal porridge is mostly forgotten, but in its time it was a steady presence on the wartime breakfast table. Salsify patties were a rare but ingenious wartime substitute for more expensive meat dishes. Salsify, sometimes called oyster plant, was a root vegetable with a flavor faintly resembling oysters, which made it a curious but useful stand-in when fish and meat were unavailable. Housewives would boil and mash salsify, mix it with breadcrumbs and seasoning, and fry it into patties that could be served as the centerpiece of a meal. The texture was soft and savory, and while it did not truly mimic meat, it offered enough substance to satisfy hungry families. Salsify was also easy to grow in victory gardens, which made it a handy crop for resourceful families. Recipes for salsify patties appeared in government cookbooks as part of the push to make vegetables carry more of the diet. Though it was practical and affordable during the war, salsify disappeared from most markets afterward, and with it, this unique recipe vanished as well. Few people today even remember the taste of salsify. Ration macaroni pie was a dish that tried to stretch limited supplies of pasta, cheese, and milk into something that felt hearty and satisfying. Families would boil macaroni, layer it in a casserole dish, and mix it with powdered milk, margarine, and small amounts of cheese. Vegetables such as onions, carrots, or cabbage were often added to bulk it out further, creating a pie-like casserole that could feed an entire family. It was filling, cheap, and relatively easy to prepare, which made it popular during the toughest ration years. Nutritionists praised it as a balanced dish since it included carbohydrates, a small amount of protein, and some vegetables. Families often served it with bread to make the meal go further, stretching every last bit of food they had. Once the war ended and cheese returned in abundance, richer pasta dishes took over and ration macaroni pie was quickly forgotten. For those who grew up with it, though, it was a symbol of making do with very little. Stewed cabbage and apples was a dish that might sound unusual today, but made perfect sense during the war years. Both cabbage and apples were widely available, affordable, and easy to store, making them reliable ingredients when others were scarce. The recipe called for slicing cabbage, stewing it slowly with apples, and adding a little vinegar or sugar when possible. The result was a sweet and savory side dish that could be served with potatoes, bread, or even the small portions of meat families managed to get. It was simple, hearty, and surprisingly flavorful given how few ingredients it required. Families often made large pots of it and reheated it over several meals, stretching their supplies even further. Government cookbooks promoted it as a nutritious and practical dish for households trying to survive rationing. After the war, as diets expanded and more options returned to markets, stewed cabbage and apples disappeared from dinner tables, remembered only as one of the clever ways families coped. Mock banana jam was one of the more curious wartime recipes, created when bananas vanished completely from American markets. Bananas were imported, and shipping disruptions meant they became impossible to get during the war. families turned to parsnips, which, when boiled, mashed, and flavored with banana extract, could mimic the taste and texture of banana jam. This strange substitute was often spread on bread or used in baking to stand in for real bananas. Children who grew up during the war sometimes had never tasted a real banana until after it ended, meaning mock banana jam was all they knew. The recipe was encouraged by government pamphlets as a way to give households a sense of normalcy in desserts and spreads. It was resourceful and creative, though many people admitted the flavor was never quite the same. Once bananas returned after the war, no one wanted to keep making parsnip jam. Today, it is one of the strangest forgotten recipes of the era. Homemade barley risotto was one of many ways people substituted grains when rice was scarce or rationed. Barley was inexpensive, filling, and easy to grow locally, which made it a popular replacement. The recipe involved simmering barley slowly in broth, sometimes with vegetables such as onions, carrots, or celery added for flavor. The result was a creamy, hearty dish that resembled risotto, though it lacked the smoothness of rice. Families embraced it as an affordable, practical meal that could feed a crowd with very little. It was also nutritious, providing fiber and minerals at a time when many diets were lacking. Barley risotto was often served as a main dish with bread or as a side to small portions of meat. While it did not become a lasting favorite after the war, it played an important role in helping households stretch their limited resources. Once rice and pasta were plentiful again, barley risotto disappeared almost completely. Today it is remembered only as one of many forgotten substitutions. Turnip top soup was one of the cleverest ways families stretched their food during the war years. The leafy tops of turnips, which many people once tossed aside as scraps, became a key ingredient when every edible part of a vegetable mattered. Housewives would simmer the greens slowly with onions, carrots, or a small piece of meat if any was available, creating a broth that was earthy and filling. In communities with victory gardens, turnips were common, and their tops were plentiful, so this soup became an easy way to feed a family without spending extra. Children often disliked the bitter flavor, but it was lightened with vinegar, milk, or even a pinch of sugar when possible. For many households, this recipe reflected the wartime spirit of not wasting a single thing. Families saw it as both practical and nutritious, since turnip tops were full of vitamins and fiber. After the war, when wastefulness returned to kitchens, turnip top soup was quickly forgotten and rarely appeared again at American dinner tables. Prune whip was one of the simplest desserts families could manage during years of sugar and butter shortages. Prunes, which were affordable, easy to store, and packed with natural sweetness, were stewed until soft and then whipped together with stiffened egg whites into a light frothy pudding. It looked elegant despite its humble ingredients, which made it a popular choice for church suppers, small celebrations, and any occasion where families wanted to pretend they were not sacrificing. The airy texture gave the impression of indulgence without requiring much sugar or fat, which were scarce luxuries at the time. Prunes also had the benefit of being highly nutritious, which allowed housewives to present this dessert as both thrifty and healthy. Children often resisted the dark flavor, but with enough sugar or honey, it became a treat they tolerated. Once butter and chocolate returned after the war, prune whip quickly lost its charm, remembered only as one of those make-do puddings from the hardest years. Celery root slaw was a crunchy, inexpensive side dish that highlighted one of the less glamorous vegetables of the era. Celery root, sometimes called celeriac, was cheap to buy, long-lasting in storage, and widely grown in victory gardens. The root was peeled, grated raw, and dressed simply with vinegar and oil, often with a pinch of mustard for added flavor. The result was a refreshing and crisp salad that made a strong contrast to the heavy stews and casseroles dominating wartime meals. It required no precious cooking fats, flour, or sugar, which made it a practical option for households low on rations. Nutritionists encouraged its use because celery root provided vitamins and fiber at a time when diets were limited. Although it was common in wartime kitchens, celery root never gained much popularity in American diets afterward. The strong, earthy taste was too unusual for most families, and once familiar vegetables returned to shelves, celery root slaw was largely forgotten, surviving only in old cookbooks. Peanut butter bran muffins were a filling wartime breakfast that combined affordable pantry staples into a surprisingly hearty food. Bran, often promoted for its nutritional value and cheap cost, was blended into muffin batter along with a small amount of flour. Peanut butter, which was inexpensive and protein-rich, served as both a flavoring and a fat substitute when butter was rationed. The muffins were baked in batches and often lasted several days, making them a practical choice for busy households. Families ate them with powdered milk or weak coffee, and children carried them to school as lunchbox snacks. They were praised for being portable, nutritious, and inexpensive, though some found them dense and heavy compared to traditional baked goods. Government pamphlets encouraged recipes like this to help stretch rations while keeping families fed. After the war, when sugar and butter returned to abundance, peanut butter bran muffins faded into obscurity, replaced by sweeter, fluffier bakery treats that were once again affordable. Potato crust quiche was a creative way to stretch both potatoes and scarce baking supplies into something resembling a pie. Wheat flour was heavily rationed, which meant making traditional pie crusts was often impossible. Housewives shredded potatoes, pressed them into pie pans, and baked them until crisp to form a substitute crust. This clever base could then be filled with eggs, vegetables, or a little bit of meat if available. The result was hearty, flexible, and cheap, making it a dependable recipe in homes that needed to stretch every bit of food. The potato crust was also versatile, since leftovers could be repurposed into new meals over the following days. Families appreciated that it required few ration coupons and could be made entirely with garden ingredients. After the war, when flour and butter returned, potato crust quiches quickly disappeared, overshadowed by traditional pies and casseroles. Today, they are remembered only as a wartime experiment in frugality and resourcefulness. Carrot croquettes were a classic example of wartime ingenuity, using a common vegetable to imitate a meat dish. Carrots were plentiful thanks to victory gardens and government promotion campaigns, which encouraged families to eat more of them for health and to offset meat shortages. Housewives mashed boiled carrots, seasoned them with herbs, rolled them in breadcrumbs, and fried them into small patties. The croquettes looked like meatballs or cutlets, which gave families the illusion of eating something more substantial than vegetables. They were inexpensive, filling, and surprisingly flavorful, especially when served with gravy or a sauce made from drippings. Children sometimes complained, but most households came to rely on carrot croquettes as a meat substitute. The dish symbolized the wartime ability to transform ordinary ingredients into something creative and satisfying. Once rationing ended and real meat was available again, carrot croquettes disappeared quickly, remembered only as a clever trick to get through years of scarcity. Oven-baked radishes were one of the stranger dishes to appear on American tables during rationing, but they made sense in context. With potatoes often scarce and expensive, families turned to any available root vegetable that could serve as a substitute. Radishes, normally eaten raw in salads, were roasted in the oven until soft and mellow. This transformed their sharp flavor into something closer to turnips or potatoes, making them surprisingly versatile as a side dish. They were baked with a little margarine, salt, and pepper when available, though some recipes suggested mixing them with breadcrumbs or cheese to add bulk. Housewives praised oven-baked radishes for stretching meals without requiring ration coupons, and they became especially popular in rural areas where radishes were easy to grow. After the war, the novelty faded quickly, and most Americans returned to traditional potatoes. Today, roasted radishes are occasionally rediscovered as a curiosity, but they remain mostly forgotten relics of wartime necessity. Powdered milk cocoa was a small comfort that carried many families through cold winters. Fresh milk was rationed heavily, so households depended on powdered milk, which was shipped in bulk and reconstituted with water. Though its flavor was bland, mixing it with cocoa powder and sugar transformed it into a treat that felt indulgent. Children especially loved it, since real chocolate bars were rare luxuries during the war. For many, a hot mug of powdered milk cocoa was the closest they ever got to a sweet dessert in those years. Housewives promoted it as nutritious and warming, while children simply saw it as a bright spot in otherwise plain diets. It was cheap, easy to prepare, and used ingredients that were almost always available, which made it a dependable staple in many homes. Once fresh milk returned to stores, however, powdered milk cocoa quickly lost favor and became a forgotten symbol of making do with what was on hand. Turnip and barley stew was one of the most sustaining meals available during World War II. Both ingredients were cheap, hearty, and easy to grow in victory gardens, which made them reliable for families struggling with rationing. The recipe combined chopped turnips with pearl barley and simmered them slowly in broth, creating a thick stew that was filling without requiring much meat. When available, housewives added carrots, onions, or bits of bacon to improve flavor, but the base of turnips and grains was enough to feed large families. Barley provided bulk and nutrition, while turnips offered vitamins and substance in place of potatoes. It was a dish praised by government pamphlets for being both thrifty and healthy, though children often dreaded its bitter flavor. For households with little else to depend on, turnip and barley stew was essential. After the war, when fresher vegetables and better cuts of meat returned, it disappeared from kitchens almost completely, remembered only by those who grew up eating it. Eggless mayonnaise cake was a remarkable creation that proved just how resourceful wartime bakers had to be. Eggs and butter were rationed heavily, and many families had none to spare for baking. The solution came in the form of mayonnaise, which contained both eggs and fat in a shelf-stable form. Housewives folded mayonnaise into cake batter, creating a surprisingly moist chocolate cake that quickly became a family favorite. Despite sounding unusual, the result was rich, tender, and delicious, making it a popular recipe passed through community cookbooks. Children loved it because it was one of the few sweet treats they could enjoy during years of scarcity. The cake was usually baked for birthdays, church gatherings, or holidays when something special was needed. After rationing ended, most households abandoned the recipe in favor of more traditional cakes made with fresh eggs and butter. Still, the eggless mayonnaise cake remains one of the most fascinating and forgotten baking tricks of the wartime years. Vienna. Sausages became a salty comfort tucked inside tiny cans that fit easily into a pack or jacket pocket. These miniature sausages were soft, smoky, and ready to eat straight from the can, which made them perfect for soldiers who lacked time or tools for cooking. The brine kept them moist and flavorful even after months in storage, and a quick warm-up over a small flame turned them into something close to a homemade meal. Troops enjoyed them with hardtack crackers or sliced into simple stews, creating a hearty snack that chased away hunger on long nights. Their familiar flavor reminded many soldiers of casual suppers back home, a quiet luxury when every other meal tasted like rations. The tiny pop of the tin's lid and the savory scent inside offered an immediate lift in morale. Years after the war, veterans still reached for those cans in grocery stores, proof that a humble sausage can carry the power of memory and survival. There's no better way of repurposing leftover mashed potatoes than making potato cakes. It's a name given to various shaped potato dishes around the world, including a patty of hashed potatoes, a fried patty of mashed potato, a fried and battered slice of potato, or a flatbread made with mashed potato and flour. These fried patties were crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, often served as a side dish or breakfast item. In northern England and some states in Australia, a thin slice of potato that was battered and deep-fried was called a potato scallop. In Australia and New Zealand, the terms potato cake, potato flip, and potato fritter were used instead. They were often flavored with onions, herbs, or cheese and served with a dollop of sour cream, or alongside other breakfast items like eggs and bacon. With the rise of hash browns, potato cakes are barely missed today, but if you ever feel like cooking something comforting, I say give this one a try. It's delicious, right? Nothing unusual about this one. It was a classic hit. Prunes were a popular choice during the Depression because they were cheap, stored well, and were, well, let's just say, effective. Many prominent figures during the 1930s ate frugally, just as most Americans did during the Great Depression. To promote the support of frugal and thrifty eating, Eleanor Roosevelt served prune pudding at formal White House functions. And that's how prunes became all the rage. The fruit was cooked until soft, mashed up, mixed with water and sugar, and a bit of flour or cornstarch to thicken it up. This dessert might not win any beauty contests, but it was a sweet treat that many families enjoyed. Prunes are not the most, luxurious of items out there. I'm sure you pass by prunes in the grocery store without even glancing at them, but they were a lifesaver for our taste buds back in the day. You know what that calls for? A place for them in your cart next time you go grocery shopping. There is nothing like taking advantage of nature's bounty with sweet dishes like apple brown betties, and if the subject is how a pie can put you in the right mood, then it is criminal not to talk about these. Usually made with apples or pears, berries, and other seasonal common fruit, the fruit would be baked, and layers of sweetened crumbs would hold it all together. The dish was the textbook definition of comfort food, and it screamed grandma's cooking in a time where many people did not know if they would see their family again. Lots of folks were suffering from malnutrition and hunger, but pies like this, which are easy to make with natural ingredients, were a blessing. Apple brown betties are not as widely consumed today as they were during the World War, but back in the day, people found solace in the dessert they could make with whatever little they had. The recipe is commendable and might taste weird to us today because of our modern tastes. There is nothing like taking advantage of nature's bounty with sweet dishes like apple brown betties, and if the subject is how a pie can put you in the right mood, then it is criminal not to talk about these. Usually made with apples or pears, berries, and other seasonal common fruit, the fruit would be baked, and layers of sweetened crumbs would hold it all together. The dish was the textbook definition of comfort food, and it screamed grandma's cooking in a time where many people did not know if they would see their family again. Lots of folks were suffering from malnutrition and hunger, but pies like this, which are easy to make with natural ingredients, were a blessing. Apple brown betties are not as widely consumed today as they were during the World War, but back in the day, people found solace in the dessert they could make with whatever little they had. The recipe is commendable and might taste weird to us today because of our modern tastes. What germ was one of the best parts of the entire kernel of wheat in general? It was that embryo that was loaded with all kinds of nutrients, and neither the people nor the government was going to miss that opportunity. They popularized it as one of the most highly nutritional foods you could get your hands on during the war, especially because of it being a source of rare vitamins like E. Wartime usage meant that there was an extreme amount of use for germ. But how were people using it? Well, lots of wartime recipes that would instead call for flour, or carbs like bread, would instead use wheat germ. Lots of people managed to make enough granola to run around one household at least with a good supply of wheat germ. It also helped lots of people bake things they otherwise couldn't. One of the better parts of being able to cook different kinds of things like that is that people started to remember that cooking was also a hobby for them, a way to let some steam out and take the edge off. Plus, wheat germ was also really good at giving you some much-needed protein, which was something people wanted to be putting in their diets as much as they regularly could, to be honest. Powdered egg scramble brought the taste of breakfast to foxholes and field camps where fresh eggs were impossible to find. Dehydrated eggs were whisked with water until they resembled the real thing, then poured into sizzling pans for a quick, protein-rich meal. Soldiers often added bits of canned meat or dried herbs to give the dish more character, but even plain it smelled like morning at home. The texture was not perfect, sometimes a little grainy, yet the familiar golden color lifted spirits before a long march. Easy to pack and lightweight, powdered eggs were shipped across oceans and stored for months without spoiling, making them a practical solution for feeding large numbers of troops. Many men joked about the rubber eggs, but few turned them down when the cold set in. For soldiers who had grown up on hearty farmhouse breakfasts, this scramble was a small but important reminder of normal life, a comfort that could fit in a simple metal cup. The Great Depression was no reason to skip gelatin packets, which were pantry staples and culinary alchemy in powdered form. Gelatin was a cook's best friend because of its uncanny ability to turn liquid into solid, allowing it to stretch ingredients farther than anyone thought possible. Why was gelatin so popular during the Depression? First of all, it was cheap and easy to store. The packets could sit on the shelf indefinitely, waiting for the day when a family had to pull something out of the cupboard, something that looked like a real meal. Gelatin was even used to make mock recipes that looked like expensive foods, so families could enjoy a taste of luxury on a shoestring budget. In the 1930s, gelatin was a sign of ingenuity and resourcefulness, but today it conjures up images of wobbly Jell-O molds at family gatherings. Its culinary heyday may be over, but gelatin is a nostalgic reminder of how far creativity can go when times are hard. Hog's head cheese is one of the more bizarre meals on the list. Okay, before you jump to any conclusions judging from the name, this meaty meal doesn't contain any cheese or any dairy products at all. This unique delicacy originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. So, if not cheese, what was it actually made of? It was basically flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold, at room temperature, or in a sandwich. This dish was popular in the post-war era as it made use of every part of the animal, reflecting a time when nothing went to waste. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. It has disappeared from our dinner tables and menus, and I don't think this one calls for a comeback. Mock cuisine in general really saw its heyday during the harsh times of rationing, especially with all the things that were famously eaten before times got so bad, like brain. People wanted more of their favorites, even if they had to compromise in some way. And things like mock brains would become really popular as a result. Known for being quite heavy on the seasoning and being laced with fat, they incorporated basic spices like hickory smoke, paprika, and garlic. People would typically have it with a tomato sauce if they could spare the ingredients, and it definitely scratched that itch that lots of US meat lovers were having around the nation. So you might be surprised to hear party franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Powdered malt, on the other hand, was something that also gave people another shot at making the things they used for comfort. People used powdered malt in baking and for making drinks at home, which was a pretty treasured source of that energy I was just talking about. You should never underestimate the importance of a good drink, especially because it's so good at lifting your mood up. Powdered malt also worked as a fantastic substitute for sugar, since that was pretty much rationed heavily throughout the war. Bakers either went out of business if they couldn't access it, or they relied entirely on powdered malt to keep themselves going. After all, what's a dessert without a sweetener? Malt extracts had things like glucose and maltose, which were pretty much the entire point of sugar to begin with. They were also helpful in keeping the ingredients you did have last longer. If you were starting to run just a bit low on your supply of molasses, then you would go for powdered malt, which was also easily available. Peanut butter sandwiches were the easiest taste of home a soldier could find, needing nothing more than bread and a sturdy spread that never spoiled. Jars of peanut butter were shipped in bulk because the high protein content and long shelf life made them invaluable in the field. Soldiers slathered it on K-ration biscuits or any bread they could find, sometimes adding a drizzle of honey or a slice of dried fruit for variety. The rich, nutty flavor provided energy for long patrols and a quick comfort when the day turned harsh. For many, it recalled childhood lunches and calm kitchen tables far from the sound of artillery. It required no cooking, no fire, and no cleanup, which made it a perfect companion on marches or during quiet nights in the barracks. Peanut butter sandwiches proved that even in a global conflict, a simple, familiar food could bridge the gap between battlefield and home front with each satisfying bite. Ever tried hot Dr. Pepper? This warm beverage was made by heating Dr. Pepper and adding lemon slices. It was used in the war days to warm up your insides during the cold winter months. Say goodbye to hot cocoa, because hot Dr. Pepper was all the rage back in the day. It was pretty simple to make. All you had to do was heat the soda to 180 degrees in a stovetop saucepan, then pour it over a thin slice of lemon. It was introduced by the brand to increase sales during colder days when no one wanted a chilly soft drink. Smart marketing, don't you think? So, why did this drink disappear? Well, people just stick to the cold serving of Dr. Pepper now, and I'm not complaining. Canned liver wasn't the most comfortable food, but it was a lifeline during the Great Depression. This pantry staple was a nutritional powerhouse, packed with protein, vitamins, and minerals, and didn't require refrigeration, a godsend for families without access to fresh meat. It was metallic and mushy, but on a day when every calorie mattered, canned liver did the trick. The canned liver was a surprisingly versatile food. It could be spread on bread for a quick meal, mixed into casseroles, or fried up with onions to make something almost palatable. Its rich flavor, sometimes too rich, made it a cheap way to feed a family because a little went a long way. Canned liver can even be blended into meatloaf or meatballs, stretching meals without sacrificing protein for those willing to get creative. Canned liver is a rare thing today, but its legacy lives on as a symbol of frugality and resilience. It wasn't about taste or presentation for Depression-era families, it was about survival. A tin of canned liver in the cupboard was evidence that even the most unappealing ingredients could keep you alive and give you hope when things got the toughest. Cottage cheese being used as a substitute for meat is another factor of cooking that you probably never thought was possible, but is actually well documented. Even the Department of Agriculture agrees that it is a pretty rocking substitute for meat as it contains a lot of protein. And when you need to get your macros in on a budget, you cannot be complaining about the source. Sure, everyone would love to fulfill their battle-action protagonist fantasies of chowing down trays and trays of meat, but we only need so many grams of protein in a day to make a bulk. Dry curd cottage cheese especially contains more protein per pound than beef or lamb, and only chicken and veal beat it at that game. It seems there is a lot of cooking know-how that can be picked up from Americans living in those times. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put 2 and 2 together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. When you hear about the way people lived in the war, you might sometimes hear about things like dried gnocchi, zucchini, or pasta. We just went over dried noodles, too. Stuff like that became just a bit more realistic to make regularly thanks to the resurgence of things like soy flour. See, the difference is soy flour was made out of defatted soybeans. These soybeans have been roasted and put into a powder that makes them, for many reasons, exactly the kind of thing you would want during a war. Exactly because they're really good in terms of how much fiber they have. Besides just that, they also have an incredible amount of iron, calcium, and vitamins. It was exactly this kind of everyday nutrition that people were missing in their day. It was also leading to people experiencing levels of illness that they never had before. Soy flour helped alleviate things like this because it meant that people could have a healthy source of flour that they could also use for all kinds of cooking. oatmeal with brown sugar, gave soldiers a rare chance at a warm, sweet start to the day when rations allowed. Quick-cooking oats were easy to ship and stored well, ready to be boiled in a mess kit over a small flame. A sprinkle of brown sugar or a drizzle of molasses turned the plain porridge into something that tasted almost like home. The hot cereal provided steady energy for long marches and kept soldiers full when other supplies were low. Many men remembered waking to the smell of oats thickening in big field pots, the scent blending with damp earth and morning fog. It was simple, nourishing, and easy to prepare even under difficult conditions. A bowl of oatmeal with brown sugar was more than food. It was a moment of calm before the day's chaos, a reminder that comfort could be found in the smallest routines even in the middle of a war that seemed endless. Corned beef hash was pretty much a mix of corned beef, potatoes, and onions. Corned beef, also known as salt beef, was popular in most Commonwealth countries during both the World Wars. Although the exact origin of corned beef is unknown, it most likely came about when people began preserving meat through salt curing. This dish was a practical way to use up leftovers and stretch food supplies, and was often served for breakfast or dinner. The best part? It was very filling at a very low cost. It is also the ultimate hangover cure before, or at least it was before, people discovered avocado toast. But let's be real, nothing beats a good plate of hash when you're craving something satisfying. During the Great Depression, walnuts and pecans weren't just a tasty snack, they were a prized resource for cash-strapped families. These nuts could be harvested, stored, and used to jazz up otherwise plain meals if you had access to a tree or a generous neighbor. Cracking nuts was labor-intensive, but the payoff was worth it. A rich, fatty ingredient that gave texture and flavor to bread and cookies, stuffing, and casseroles. In the South, pecans were a common sight, falling straight from the trees and into resourceful hands for those lucky enough to live there. The shells of walnuts were tougher, but the reward was similar. Nuts were also very nutritious, with healthy fats, protein, and vitamins that were hard to find in other foods, and they stored well and could even be bartered or sold when money was tight. Depression-era families used them to make nut-based candies, nut milk, and even to top their cornbread pudding. Classic Southern pies needed pecans, and walnuts made their way into cakes and confections. Walnuts and pecans were a luxury that came from nature in a time of indulgences that were rare. Back then, they were a little piece of heaven in tough times, and today, they're a treat. Ever thought you would have a Cassie with no meat in it? An economy loaf is just that, and we could not have named it better if you put a gun to our head. Using potatoes, peas, flour, eggs, and some basic seasoning, this was a loaf made entirely of alternatives to meat, so for vegans it is a recipe to keep in mind throughout the ages. But in the rationing-ridden times of World War II, it was a godsend to have this quick and easy loaf. It was even popular enough to be in cookbooks like The Modern Hostess, even its special patriotic edition. Roosevelt's presidency really saw some gems, right? Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. So besides just canned meat and the kinds of things people were out there hunting, there was also potted meat. What was potted meat? Good question, dear viewer. It's one I asked immediately, too. You actually make this by cooking some really well-grounded meat that was then repackaged, sealed, and sold in a jar or a can of fat and broth and jelly? Basically, it meant that people were able to get a long-lasting source of meat that could suit everyone's household. After all, not everyone was equipped and loaded with a fridge to work with. Not everyone had a basement that would get cold enough in the winters either. Stuff like potted meat, canned meat. All of this was essential because it applied to more or less everyone. Why was it called potted meat in specific, though? Well, when you would prepare this kind of meat, you would make a lot of use of a pot. It was common to put that meat into the pot and cover it with fat. Then you would seal it and preserve it. Things like these were how most families lived during the World War. K-ration biscuits were the crunchy lifeline tucked inside every small khaki box that soldiers carried on patrol. These dense crackers were baked hard to last for months, providing a quick burst of carbohydrates without the need for cooking. Soldiers munched them dry, spread them with peanut butter, or crumbled them into soups to add body. Though plain in flavor, their durability and compact size made them perfect for long marches when every ounce of gear mattered. They held up through tropical humidity and bitter cold, never losing their crispness. Some men joked they could break a tooth, while others swore they were the best part of the ration kit because they stayed edible when other items spoiled. In the chaos of combat, a biscuit that never failed became a quiet reassurance. Back home, the same recipe inspired civilian crackers and snack breads, proof that even the simplest field food could leave a lasting mark on American kitchens. While we're on the topic of ham, this next dish added a fruity twist to it. Yep, we're talking about ham and banana hollandaise. Sweet banana, salty ham, and rich, creamy hollandaise sauce. Some might call it adventurous, others might call it a crime against food. This dish made a lot of buzz in the 1970s, and bananas have never appeared more out of their element ever since. It was featured in McCall's Great American Recipe Card collection in 1973 and took the world by storm due to its uniqueness. The hollandaise was a creamy sauce, first born in France and was originally known as sauce Isigny, named after a small town in Normandy famous for its butter and cream. This dish really proves that in a time of desperation, anyone will eat anything. But hey, at least it was memorable. Barley is not glamorous, but it was a culinary workhorse during the Great Depression. This ancient grain was a go-to ingredient for families who wanted to fill empty stomachs without emptying their wallets. Its biggest strength was its versatility. It gave soups and stews heartiness, porridge a stick-to-your-ribs breakfast, and even found its way into bread and dumplings. Depression-era dishes got a comforting depth from their chewy texture and nutty flavor, proving that simple ingredients could still be satisfying. Barley was a resilient crop, growing well on poor soil and surviving harsh weather, which farmers liked because it meant they could count on it to grow even in uncertain times. It is stored beautifully once harvested, good for months in cool, dry places. Barley thus became a staple of the pantry for rural families and urban households alike. Barley wasn't just about food, it was about community. In hard times, neighbors gathered to share recipes and tips for stretching their barley supply, creating a sense of community. Barley is today a niche ingredient, celebrated for its health benefits and rustic charm. During the Depression, it was a survival tool, showing that even the most humble grains could keep a family together through the worst of days. Fish soufflé and baked potatoes were a wonderful combination, the kind of thing that just bounces off of the beach of its different parts and sides. The fish soufflé, along with a generous serving of baked potato, wasn't just delicious, it was also extremely nutritious. This was probably one of the recipes that kept up health the most throughout the whole ordeal. You might be wondering how fish was common enough for the recipe to have this kind of weight behind it. It just so happens that if you lived near a coastal city back then, you were definitely in luck, at least compared to the rest of the population. Fishing skyrocketed, not as a hobby this time, but as a necessary skill. Fish were plentiful, and most of all, they were free. They were the main source of nutrition for a lot of places. When people had no use for fish as food, they'd sell it to make some quick money and get whatever necessities they needed. Besides, it was common enough to get things like crab in the waters back then too. Corned beef. Hash became a dependable favorite because it turned preserved beef and potatoes into something that felt almost like a home-cooked meal. The meat arrived in cans, heavily salted and ready for a quick chop, while potatoes and onions were diced and fried until golden. When mixed together in a hot skillet, the ingredients formed a crispy crust that soldiers craved after long marches or cold nights. Its rich aroma cut through the damp smells of barracks and battlefields, offering comfort beyond its simple makeup. This dish filled stomachs with steady protein and carbohydrates that kept energy high during missions. Mess hall cooks could prepare huge pans at once, feeding entire units without complicated equipment. Many soldiers carried the memory of that hearty hash long after they returned, and it found a place in American diners where veterans sought familiar flavors. Corned beef hash proved that with a little heat and patience, even the plainest rations could become something worth remembering. If one of these forgotten recipes surprised you, drop a comment, hit like and subscribe to keep uncovering history one meal at a time.